This is Tiffany Chaffin. A mother. A woman who spent years raising two sons she hoped would build good lives for themselves. Tyler Chaffin. Eli Chaffin. To Tiffany, they weren't defendants. They weren't headlines. They weren't names in court documents. They were her boys. The children she watched grow up. The children she taught, protected, and believed in. But on July 24, 2022, everything changed. In the quiet rural communities of San Juan County, New Mexico, a chain of events was unfolding that would end in gunfire, death, and years of legal battles. Just after noon, deputies with the San Juan County Sheriff's Office were dispatched to a residence on County Road 3400. Someone had been shot. When deputies arrived, they found 37-year-old William Johnson dead. Witnesses reported seeing a white SUV pull up to the property. Two men got out. Weapons were seen. Then multiple shots rang out. Before the day was over, investigators would identify two brothers as suspects: Tyler Chaffin and Eli Chaffin. By that evening, law enforcement officers had located a vehicle they believed was connected to the shooting. The brothers were arrested. And a homicide investigation was underway. For Tiffany Chaffin, the nightmare was only beginning. Somewhere between sunrise and sunset, her family's future had been shattered. A man was dead. Two brothers were accused of murder. And two families were about to find themselves on opposite sides of a tragedy that neither would ever fully escape. At first glance, the case seemed straightforward. A shooting. Witnesses. Suspects. An arrest. But as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a story involving complicated relationships, personal conflicts, allegations of conspiracy, and a confrontation that prosecutors would later argue did not happen by accident. Questions began to emerge. What really happened on County Road 3400? Why did the brothers go there? Was this a planned attack? Did someone lure them into a deadly confrontation? Or did events spiral out of control in a matter of seconds? Years later, those questions would still divide families, attorneys, investigators, and members of the public. Because what happened that summer day would eventually lead to plea agreements, emotional courtroom confrontations, accusations of injustice, and a mother standing before a judge asking for mercy for her sons. Over the next hour, we'll follow the timeline of the Chaffin brothers' homicide case. From the relationships that set the stage, to the deadly confrontation itself. The investigation. The arrests. The prosecution's theory. The defense's explanation. And the emotional fallout that continues to echo long after the gunfire stopped. This is the story of William Johnson, Tyler and Eli Chaffin. And the mother caught in the middle of it all. A mother named Tiffany Chaffin. Before police reports. Before court hearings. Before headlines that would spread across news outlets and social media. There was a family. Not a case file. Not a set of charges. Just a mother raising two sons in a world she was trying to keep stable, ordinary, and safe. Tiffany Chaffin. A parent navigating the challenges of raising boys into adulthood. Those who knew her described a life that, on the surface, was not defined by violence or headlines, but by routine, responsibility, and the everyday effort of keeping a family together. Tyler Chaffin was her older son. Eli Chaffin was her younger son. Like many families, their lives were shaped by shared experiences, school years, friendships, and the quiet transitions from childhood into adulthood. At home, Tiffany was not thinking about courtrooms or criminal statutes. She was thinking about family. About her son's future. About keeping life moving forward. But as investigators would later outline in public court proceedings, the relationships surrounding that family extended beyond home life and into a wider social circle, one that would eventually become central to the events of July 24, 2022. Still, at the center of it all was a mother. A mother who knew her sons in a way no document or report ever could. Tyler. Eli. Two names that, for her, carried memories long before they were ever spoken in a courtroom. Moments that cannot be captured in police narratives. Like family photographs taken in better times. Birthdays. Holidays. Ordinary days that never felt ordinary while they were happening. Smiles that, at the time, meant nothing more than family life moving forward as it always had. But like many families, there were also challenges. Tensions that exist behind closed doors. Decisions that are never documented in official reports. And the complicated reality of watching children grow into adults while still seeing them, in some ways, as the kids they once were. What remains clear is this. Tiffany Chaffin was a mother first. Long before she was ever connected to any investigation. Long before her family name appeared in news coverage. And long before her sons were pulled into a homicide case that would change everything. No parent imagines their children becoming the center of a criminal investigation. No mother raises her sons expecting their names to be spoken in connection with a death. But life does not always follow expectation. And sometimes, it shifts in ways that cannot be reversed. By the summer of 2022, the foundation of that family's life was about to be tested in a way no one could have prepared for. And what had once been a private family story was about to become part of a public investigation. Everything was about to change. To understand what happened on July 24, 2022, you have to understand the people at the center of it. Because this case did not begin with gunfire. It began with relationships, connections, and a series of events that, according to investigators, slowly pulled multiple lives into the same orbit. At the center of that orbit was William Johnson. To those who knew him, he was not a headline. He was a man with ties to the local community in San Juan County, New Mexico. A man with a personal history, relationships, and connections that would later become part of the investigation's timeline. By the time authorities arrived at the scene, William Johnson was already gone. But in the days that followed, investigators began reconstructing who he was in life. His relationships. His interactions. And how those connections may have intersected with the events that led to his death. On the other side of the story were the Chaffin brothers. Tyler Chaffin, the older of the two, described through court proceedings as someone whose actions and decisions would later become a central focus of the prosecution's case. Someone whose involvement placed him directly within the chain of events that investigators were working to reconstruct. And Eli Chaffin, the younger brother, drawn into the same sequence of events. His role would later become a major point of dispute in court. Specifically what he believed was happening in the moments leading up to the shooting, and how that belief shaped his actions. But this case was not only about two brothers. There was also Sierra Collins, a woman whose name would surface repeatedly during the investigation. According to court records and statements later presented by investigators, her relationships and personal connections became part of the broader timeline that authorities were trying to understand. Her interactions with the victim, and her connection to the individuals involved. All of it would later be examined as investigators attempted to determine motive, intent, and how the confrontation ultimately came together. By July 2022, these lives were no longer separate stories. They were becoming one. A network of relationships, disputes, allegiances, and unresolved tensions that investigators would later argue created the conditions for a violent encounter. From the outside, it might have appeared like an isolated incident. A confrontation that escalated. A shooting that happened in the heat of the moment. But as detectives dug deeper into statements, timelines, and communications, a different picture began to emerge. One that suggested planning, coordination, and prior connection between the individuals involved. And that changed everything. Because this was no longer just a shooting under investigation. It was becoming a case about intent. About motive. And about how quickly personal conflict can turn into irreversible tragedy. Twist number 1 begins here. At first glance, it looked like a simple shooting. A single moment of violence. A single outcome. But investigators soon realized nothing about this case was simple. And nothing about it could be understood without going back to everything that happened before that moment on County Road 3400. To understand how a confrontation turns deadly, you don't start with the gunfire. You start with the hours before it. The morning of July 24, 2022, began like any other day. Ordinary. Unremarkable. But according to later investigative findings and court-presented timelines, beneath that normal surface, a sequence of movements was already unfolding. By the afternoon, multiple individuals connected to the case were already in motion. Traveling, communicating, crossing paths that would later be reconstructed through phone data, witness statements, and location analysis conducted by investigators. Law enforcement would later rely heavily on digital evidence to rebuild this timeline. Phone activity, call records, text messages, and location information that helped map where certain individuals were at specific points in time. Each piece of data became a fragment of a larger picture. A picture that investigators were trying to assemble in real time after the shooting had already occurred. Vehicle movements also became critical. Who was traveling? When they were traveling? And where they were heading in the hours leading up to the confrontation. Witnesses would later describe seeing vehicles in motion throughout the area that day. Movements that, at the time, may not have seemed significant, but in hindsight, became key pieces of a timeline that prosecutors and investigators would argue was anything but random. As investigators reviewed statements and digital records, several questions began to surface. Why were Tyler and Eli Chaffin traveling together that day? Was it planned? Was it spontaneous? Or was there already an understanding of where the day was headed? And perhaps more importantly, who knew where William Johnson was before the confrontation ever began? That question would become central to the entire case. Because if contact was not accidental, then the entire narrative of what happened begins to shift. Investigators worked to determine whether there had been prior communication, whether locations had been shared, whether movements that day were coordinated in advance. Each new detail added weight to the theory that the events of July 24 did not unfold in isolation. They unfolded in sequence. Step by step. Choice by choice. Until multiple paths converged at the same point. As the afternoon gave way to evening, tension in the timeline began to tighten. Distances closed. Movements aligned. And the final moments before the confrontation began to take shape. Every minute mattered. Every phone call carried potential significance. Every text message became a possible clue. Every decision made that day would later be examined under the full weight of a homicide investigation. Because what seemed ordinary in real time would later be rebuilt as something far more critical. And as the sun began to lower over San Juan County, the final movements were already in motion. Unaware. Unseen. But irreversible. As evening approached, the collision course was nearly complete. By this point in the timeline, the movements, the communications, and the distances had all converged. What investigators would later describe as the final sequence of events now brought multiple individuals to the same location. William Johnson's property in rural San Juan County, New Mexico. A place that, until that moment, had been part of everyday life. Quiet. Remote. Unremarkable. But according to investigative reports and later courtroom testimony, it became the setting of a fatal confrontation. Witnesses in the area would later report seeing vehicles arrive, including a white SUV that matched descriptions later associated with the Chaffin brothers. In the moments that followed, everything happened quickly. Too quickly for certainty. Too quickly for time to be measured in anything other than fragments. According to investigators, a confrontation began. It is believed that words were exchanged between the individuals involved. The exact content of those exchanges would later become part of disputed accounts presented in court. But what followed next was not in dispute. Tension escalated. Rapidly. From verbal exchange to physical confrontation. And then, gunfire erupted. Multiple shots were reported. The sound cutting through the rural silence of the area. Witness accounts described chaos unfolding in real time. Confusion. Movement. Vehicles departing the scene. And the sudden realization that something irreversible had just occurred. William Johnson was struck during the encounter. And within moments, he collapsed at the scene. Emergency response was requested. But it was already too late. As first responders arrived, they were met with a scene that immediately indicated a homicide investigation. Evidence was documented. The area was secured. And investigators began the process of trying to understand exactly what had happened in those critical minutes. In the hours that followed, law enforcement would begin collecting statements, witness recollections, physical evidence, and early accounts from those connected to the incident. Each detail would later be scrutinized. Each statement compared against phone records, timelines, and forensic findings. But in the immediate aftermath, none of that clarity existed. Only shock. Only fragments. Only questions. For the Chaffin family. For the Johnson family. And for the investigators now standing in the middle of a scene that had just shifted from an argument to a death investigation. Because within minutes of the gunfire, the classification of the case changed forever. From disturbance to homicide. And as officers secured the scene under the fading light of that July evening, one reality became unavoidable. A man was dead. And nothing that followed would ever undo what had just happened. When law enforcement arrived at the scene, the situation had already shifted from urgency to investigation. Emergency personnel moved in quickly. But there was nothing left to save. The focus changed immediately. From response to documentation. From rescue to reconstruction. Deputies secured the area, establishing boundaries around William Johnson's property and the surrounding rural terrain. What they found was a scene that required careful, methodical processing. Nothing could be assumed. Everything had to be recorded, photographed, measured, and preserved. Detectives quickly realized something critical. This was not a routine shooting investigation. It was layered, complex, and already filled with inconsistencies that would need to be resolved through evidence, not speculation. Physical evidence became the first priority. Shell casings recovered from the scene. Spending patterns of bullet trajectories, impact points, and the position of the victim in relation to the surrounding environment. Each detail was documented as investigators worked to establish a precise sequence of what occurred in those final moments. Ballistics evidence would later play a key role, helping investigators determine the type of weapon used, the number of shots fired, and the direction from which those shots may have been discharged. At the same time, witness statements began to shape the early narrative. Different accounts, different perspectives, each one offering fragments of what people believed they saw or heard. But not all statements aligned. And that inconsistency would become one of the early challenges in the case. Scene documentation added another layer. Photographs, measurements, vehicle impressions, and environmental details that helped reconstruct the physical space where the confrontation occurred. Yet even with all of this information, the picture was still incomplete. Some evidence appeared straightforward at first glance. Clear indicators of violence. Clear signs of a fatal encounter. But other pieces of evidence created new questions. Timing discrepancies, conflicting recollections, and gaps in the sequence of events that investigators could not immediately explain. And then came the shift. Twist number 2. Almost immediately after processing the scene, investigators expanded their focus beyond the property itself. Because they were no longer only asking what happened at the scene. They were asking what led to it. Who arrived first? Who knew who would be there? And whether the confrontation was truly spontaneous, or the result of events that began long before law enforcement ever arrived. The investigation was no longer contained to a single location. It was expanding outward. Into phone records. Into relationships. Into movements hours before the shooting. And as detectives began pulling on those threads, the case started to open in ways that would change its entire direction. With the crime scene secured and initial evidence collected, the investigation moved into its most critical phase. Reconstruction. Detectives began working backward. Step by step. Hour by hour. tracing the movements of everyone believed to be connected to the events of July 24, 2022. The focus shifted away from what was immediately visible at the scene and toward what could not be seen. Phone records became one of the most important tools in the investigation. Call logs, text message activity, and communication patterns that helped establish connections between individuals in the hours leading up to the confrontation. Digital evidence provided a framework, a timeline that investigators could compare against witness statements and physical observations. Vehicle movements were also analyzed, where certain vehicles were reported, when they were seen, and how those sightings aligned with digital location data and witness recollections. Interviews added another layer. Statements were taken from individuals who either witnessed parts of the incident or had knowledge of events that preceded it. And with each new piece of information, investigators began building a broader picture of the day. A picture that extended far beyond a single property and far beyond a single moment of violence. The central question guiding the entire investigation became unavoidable. Was this a spontaneous confrontation that escalated beyond control? Or was it something that had been building in advance? Planned, coordinated, and executed in a way investigators were still trying to fully understand. As detectives compared timelines, statements, and digital evidence, patterns began to emerge. Connections that were not immediately obvious at the scene, but became clearer when viewed across the entire sequence of events. And at the center of this expanding investigation was Sierra Collins. Her name appeared in multiple aspects of the case file. Through relationships, through communications, and through accounts that investigators sought to verify as they reconstructed the timeline. According to investigative interest noted in public reporting and court proceedings, her statements and connections were reviewed as part of the broader effort to understand motive and context. Not as a standalone focus, but as a potential link within a larger chain of events. Detectives worked to determine how each individual's actions fit into the timeline, what they knew, when they knew it, and how those details aligned with the movements that ultimately led to the confrontation. Every interview, every record, every data point, it all fed into a growing theory of the case. But at this stage, nothing was final. Nothing was confirmed. Only patterns were emerging. And those patterns were pointing investigators toward a conclusion they could not ignore. That the events of that day may not have been isolated, may not have been accidental, and may not have been as simple as they first appeared. Eventually, after weeks of collecting evidence, analyzing data, and comparing statements, detectives believed they had reached a threshold. Enough information, enough corroboration, enough clarity to move forward. But in cases like this, enough is never the end. It is only the beginning of the next phase. Because once investigators believe they understand the timeline, the next step is accountability. When investigators reach a point like this, the investigation stops being quiet and becomes public. The arrests of Tyler Chaffin and Eli Chaffin marked that shift. What had once been a private investigation was now a matter of official charges. Law enforcement moved in to take both brothers into custody. Separately. Deliberately. As procedures require in a homicide case. Tyler Chaffin was arrested. Eli Chaffin was arrested. And with those arrests came the formal announcement of charges tied to the death of William Johnson. For the public, the news spread quickly. In a case already marked by complexity, the idea of two brothers being arrested in connection with a single homicide added another layer of shock. Media coverage intensified. Headlines formed within hours. And the details of the case began circulating far beyond the rural community where it began. In San Juan County and beyond. The response was immediate. Shock. Confusion. Disbelief. And debate over what truly happened on that July day. But behind every headline, behind every report, there was a family at the center of it all. Tiffany Chaffin. A mother who was no longer processing ordinary life, but instead, processing the collapse of everything she understood about her family's future. Imagine that moment. The moment when law enforcement confirms that your sons, the children you raised, are now accused in connection with a man's death. In an instant, two realities collide. The mother who remembers raising them, and the public narrative now defining them through allegations and charges. At that point, Tiffany Chaffin was placed in an impossible position. Caught between supporting her children and confronting the weight of a life that had been lost. Between loyalty as a mother and the reality of a homicide investigation involving her own family. It is a space no parent is prepared to occupy. And yet, in this case, it became unavoidable. As the legal process began to move forward, the questions only deepened. What exactly happened during that confrontation? What evidence would be presented in court? And how would each side interpret the same events in completely different ways? Because while the arrests marked a major turning point, they did not bring closure. They did not deliver answers. They only opened the door to a longer, more complicated legal battle. One that would unfold in courtrooms. Through testimony. Through evidence. And through arguments that would attempt to define intent, responsibility, and truth. But for Tiffany Chaffin, and for both families involved, the case had already moved beyond legal definitions. Because once arrests are made, there is no return to normal. Only what comes next. As the case moved deeper into the legal system, the focus shifted from investigation to interpretation. Two competing narratives began to take shape. Two versions of the same day. And two completely different explanations for how a man ended up dead in rural San Juan County. According to prosecutors, the events of July 24, 2022 were not random. They were not accidental. They were the result of intent, planning, and responsibility shared by those who chose to go to William Johnson's property that day. In the prosecution's theory, the movements, the communications, and the convergence at the scene were all pieces of a coordinated chain of events that led directly to a deadly outcome. They argued that what happened did not begin at the moment of confrontation, but long before it. Through decisions made in advance. And actions that, taken together, resulted in a fatal encounter. But the defense presented a very different picture. According to defense attorneys, this was not a planned attack. It was a rapidly unfolding confrontation. One driven by fear, confusion, and escalation in a moment where control was lost in seconds. They argued that the situation developed unpredictably. That the individuals involved were reacting, not orchestrating. And that the shooting occurred under circumstances consistent with perceived threat and self-defense concerns. Eli Chaffin's statements became a central part of this argument. According to accounts presented through legal proceedings, his involvement was framed through the lens of protecting his brother during a confrontation that escalated far beyond what anyone anticipated. That claim would later become a key point of dispute. Because intent and perception often sit on opposite sides of the courtroom. Inside the courtroom itself, the case became a battle of interpretation. Arguments were made. Counterarguments followed. Motions were filed and challenged. Evidence was debated piece by piece. What one side presented as proof of planning, the other side framed as incomplete context. What one side called coordination, the other called coincidence. And as the legal process unfolded, the truth, as presented to the court, became less about what happened in a single moment, and more about how that moment should be understood. Then came the turning point. Twist number 3. Just when many expected the case to proceed to a full murder trial, with witnesses, testimony, and a jury weighing every detail, everything changed. Behind the scenes, discussions began. Negotiations took shape. And the direction of the case shifted away from a public trial toward resolution through plea agreements. A decision that would redefine not only the legal outcome, but the emotional response from both families involved. Because in cases like this, the courtroom is not always where answers are delivered. Sometimes, It is where outcomes are decided before the first witness ever takes the stand. As the case moved toward what many expected would be a full trial, something changed the trajectory entirely. Behind closed doors, away from the courtroom spotlight, plea negotiations took shape. Discussions between prosecution and defense that would ultimately determine the outcome of the case without a jury ever hearing the full presentation of evidence. Instead of a public trial, with witnesses taking the stand, with cross-examinations and closing arguments, the case took a different path. A negotiated resolution. Eli Chaffin ultimately entered a manslaughter plea. A legal acknowledgement that carried consequences, but avoided the uncertainty of a jury verdict on more serious charges. Tyler Chaffin entered a no-contest plea to second-degree murder. A decision that, in legal terms, did not admit guilt outright, but allowed sentencing to proceed as if the charge had been accepted. For the victim's family, the outcome brought no closure. Only pain, frustration, and anger over what they believed the resolution represented. For them, the plea agreements did not fully reflect the gravity of the loss they experienced, and they voiced those concerns in strong emotional terms during the sentencing process. But within the Chaffin family, the reaction was far more complex. For Tiffany Chaffin, there was no simple emotional response. There was relief that the legal process had reached an endpoint, but also heartbreak, as the consequences of that outcome became permanent, and deep internal conflict between the reality of what had happened and the reality of the children she raised. This is the reality in cases like this. One family sees accountability, another family sees mercy, but neither outcome restores what was lost. William Johnson does not return, and no legal resolution can undo that absence. As sentencing concluded, the courtroom did not feel like an ending. It felt like a dividing line between two families now connected forever by a single moment that changed everything. In the end, the Chaffin brothers' case is not just defined by a homicide. It is defined by everything surrounding it. Family, loyalty, choices made in moments of tension, and consequences that cannot be reversed once they unfold. At the center of that reality remains Tiffany Chaffin. Perhaps no one reflects the weight of this case more clearly than her. A mother who raised two sons. A mother who lived through their childhood years in ordinary moments that now feel distant compared to everything that followed. Birthdays that once meant celebration. School events that once filled her attention. Family dinners that once felt routine. All of it existing long before courtrooms, charges, and prison sentences became part of her reality. Now, those memories sit alongside something far heavier. The knowledge that her sons' lives became permanently tied to a criminal case. And a death that reshaped two families forever. One man lost his life. William Johnson. Two brothers lost their freedom. Tyler Chaffin. Eli Chaffin. And two families lost the future they once believed they were building. Not just altered, but permanently redirected by a single day. The question that remains is not whether lives were changed. That is already clear. The question is whether the events of July 24, 2022, could ever have been prevented. Whether different choices, different timing, or different decisions in those critical hours could have led to a different outcome. And for everyone involved in this case, that question does not come with an answer. Only with silence. And the lasting weight of what happened. On a single day that changed everything. What do you think happened that day? Do you believe the plea agreements delivered justice? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoy in-depth true crime documentaries, subscribe to Dark Case Files and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. Like and subscribe for more videos like this.